We're joined in the studio by a young go-getter, the dark horse in the race to become Britain's next ambassador to the US, extraordinary, plenipotentiary, the man who is single-handedly responsible for the sky-rocketing Iron Brew sales in Parliament. SNP superstar Nicola Sturgeon's biggest threat,
Cool.
John Nicholson. Welcome back to the programme.
Hello, Andrew.
So, an extra £800 million for Scotland in this autumn statement. How are you going to spend it all?
I don't know the answer to that question, I'm afraid. I don't have my hands on the purse strings of the Scottish Government. So that, of course, will be for our Finance Secretary to unveil.
You'll need it now that this 10 billion trade deal with China has unravelled. The Chinese calling it a Scottish shambles.
Some Chinese people are calling it a Scottish shambles.
The ones who were involved in it.
And some Scottish people are calling it a Chinese shambles.
Who needed it more? I think you've answered the question.
Well, of course it didn't end quite as we would have liked.
Mrs Sturgeon talks about the uncertainty caused by Brexit and so on. But I suggest to you the biggest uncertainty isn't Brexit in Scotland, it's the prospect of a second referendum.
Which, of course, the Conservative leader talks about every day, incessantly. The people who talk about the second referendum all the time are the Scottish Tories, because they've got a battle plan, which is to peel away the unionist right from the Labour Party and to get them to vote Tory.
So you don't talk
and they're
about
quite
it.
Successful. Well, actually, I think, I can't remember the last time I talked about a second referendum. I'm asked about it by journalists, and I hear Ruth Davidson talking about it all the time.
Mrs Sturgeon talks about it.
Yeah, a bit. And there a bit. And,
At her party conference,
well,
for
look,
example.
there's no secret. The SNP is committed to
That's
Scottish
what she said on the first day. No, but she talked about a second referendum. I mean,
the SNP is
there's a
committed
bill
to
going
Scottish
through Holyrood
independence.
Draft legislation.
to prepare for it.
It will come as a surprise to nobody that we want to see Scottish independence. And the manifesto, as you know, said that if there was a material change in circumstances, which there clearly has been, they reserve the right to hold another one.
But if you're a business, in Scotland, only 17% of your exports go to Europe. 65% come south of the border. So the prospect of a second referendum is much more unsettling than Brexit.
Well, of course, unless we take Mrs May at her word, and she's going to get this cracking deal with the European Union, and Scotland as a member of the European Union would have the best of both worlds, as we were promised. Independence plus trade with the European Union as a European Union member with the UK, or RUC, as we'd be calling it, the rest of the UK.
Very well.
So hardly a material change in circumstances after all.
Well, it depends how it all pans out, doesn't it?
Speaking of how it pans out, is the triple lock on pensions, given the Chancellor's references to it, are its days numbered?
Yes, I imagine they are, because, I mean, one of the things we've seen, of course, is the redistribution of wealth towards the older people and the further impoverishment of the young people. And there's been an absolute guarantee for older people. And that guarantee, I'm afraid, is not going to be appropriate in our new economic circumstances, or actually even in our old economic circumstances.
It's certainly true. I mean, the IFS chart today, where the average wages in real terms don't rise at all until the beginning of the next decade, if they do then. But when you break it down by age, if you're over 60, they've actually risen pretty strongly. If you're between, I think it's about 18 and 30, they've not just stayed flat, they've actually gone down. But who'll have the guts to do this?
I think the Chancellor's right to look at this. The very first OBR report said, unless we look at the impact of us all living for longer, that's not just pensions but health and social care too, it will mean that the public finances aren't sustainable over the long term. I think he's right to look at it. We know that the people who've benefited most over recent years have predominantly been those over 60 who own their own properties, particularly in London and the South East. It is not fair to see the working age population carry all this burden, but it is politically
toxic.
Very toxic, very difficult indeed.
And a lot of young people say, don't they? They say, you baby boomers, you voted for Brexit, you've landed us with all this economic chaos, and now you want us to deal with this economic chaos and guarantee your pensions. I'm not saying it's a fair charge, but that's, as you know,
actually,
what some people say.
I don't think that that's how families are. You know, if I think about my parents, who are classic baby boomers, benefited from free education, own their own home, they're as worried about my brother and his kids, whether he can afford the house to send the kids to university. My brother's worried about them if they get old and frail and need help and support. We don't need to see this as a war of the generations, because I think families want to help one another.
No, I agree with
but
that.
it's the politics that is difficult.
And going back to the borrowing, by the way, scarcely anyone ever mentions that all the extra borrowing is simply a burden that is being passed down to future generations. And what that means is when interest rates have risen again, the servicing of the debt will be quite expensive, and it means there'll be less to spend on health, less to spend on welfare, and so on and so on and so on.
Nigel Farage, Christmas comes every day for him.
Absolutely astonishing. But you know, you have to acknowledge that the man plays his hand brilliantly. He has a major part in British history. He spooked the last Prime Minister into holding a referendum. He called it right on Trump when the British government called it wrong. And he's reaping the rewards.
And it's so delicious, the idea that he's going to end this year possibly as an economic migrant, moving to the United States. You couldn't make it up.
You're right, he's described that as nonsense, but who knows? I think even he knows he's not going to be British ambassador in Washington. Maybe Kazakhstan, but not Washington.
Was it definitely a snub by Trump? He is so unsophisticated and gauche that he may just think that every time there's an election, the administration changes.
But even so, he does understand different parties. I mean, he has just fought an election himself. He would understand that this fellow is not in the Conservative Party.
So hold on, you've just lost a 10 billion free trade deal with China. You've now called unsophisticated and gauche this massive investor in two of Scotland's biggest golf courses. Why don't we go for a hat trick? Who else do you want to insult tonight?
I think John's forgotten that he's won the election now. He is going to be the president of the United States.
We know that, but
time to bow down.
We can all Google what we've said before. We can't really start backtracking on our views on Mr. Trump, can we?
This is true. Why do you think so many Brexiteers are over the moon at the prospect of Tony Blair making a comeback?
I think he's a very polarising person.
Which side are you?
He's definitely Marmite. He's always worth listening to. And I think he's asking the right questions about Brexit. He's saying that the way that we deal with the problems globalisation is creating is not to try and pretend we can
but
turn
is
back
he a
the
help
clock
or
or
a
be
hindrance?
Isolationist. For the people who like him, or the people who want to hear someone standing up for the 48%, he'll help.
Is he a help
the
or a
people who
hindrance?
hate him, they'll carry on hating him.
Well, I think our initial reaction, I speak as a Brexiteer, is to say, you know, bring it on. We'd love him to come along because he's so unpopular. But actually, one has to remember he is a formidable politician. For
Indeed.
the 10 years that he was Prime Minister, no one could lay a glove upon him. So I don't think I want to be quite as glib as to say that.
Very well. Yes or no, help or hindrance?
He's fantastically articulate.
Just yes or no.
He's quite toxic. He's great for the Scottish National Party because he killed the Labour Party in Scotland.
Very well. We got the hat trick in the end. John Nicholson, thank you. Now, it's been a week of rather bad manners, folks. As we say, Tony Blair threatened a comeback, but along the way he had to deny he'd called Jezza a nutter and Theresa May a lightwood. As John says, you can't un-Google these things. Labour MPs completely ignored their own shadow chancellor of the dispatch box so they could play Pokemon Go. And to top it all off, our little porty here was thrown out of Lulu's for trying to pardon a turkey in the middle of the restaurant. But thankfully, Nigel Farage is the gift that keeps on giving. He showed us that it's not actually rude for a US president to tell us what to do, especially if he gets a job from it, which is why Stuart Lee is putting our P's and Q's in this week's Spotlight.